Our last one today is a bit more optimistic and something that's really piqued my curiosity. Over the past few weeks, I've been noticing on Twitter this trend about Final Fantasy 14. And I was like, oh right, okay, so that new expansion must be out I've heard about. No, there's no expansion out yet, it's not due out to the end of the year. Well, what's all this about? So I went to Google and I typed in the most pedestrian of questions: why is Final Fantasy 14 so popular? And Victoria Rose over an MMORPG had the answer for me. Again, excerpt article, full article in the description. Victoria writes, there's absolutely no ignoring anymore the massive exodus of gamers into Final Fantasy 14. And put bluntly, it's unprecedented for any game that's run as long as 14 has. Players are noting that servers are getting clogged up, and even Square Enix themselves are having issues getting codes out fast enough. Some call it a World of Warcraft exodus, as many are coming from long-standing king of MMORPGs. Frankly though, it's not that simple. A perfect storm of factors from all over the game and space has led to these last few weeks. Yes, this includes a backlash against the game's inspiration World of Warcraft, which even the game's director has praised. But players could go to any other MMORPG, including Guild Wars 2, which has a similar free account system to 14 and a perfectly decent story. So, what powered the hype for Final Fantasy 14? It's been chugging along for quite a while now actually, and plenty of factors over the past few years have given it fuel. One of the first things you'll hear about 14 is that it only gets better after A Realm Reborn, the base game. In fact, despite being the base game, A Realm Reborn is actually the game's 2.0 edition, so it's already better per se. The tale of Final Fantasy XIV's titular rebirth is an integral part of the game's fame. Director Nakomi Yoshida, who previously helped the Dragon Quest series afloat for Square Enix, was brought on board during Final Fantasy XIV's 1.0 game, which, despite many quirks that are still praised to this day, was considered a complete and utter disaster. The game made a canonical reset by unleashing Bahamut, one of the franchise's most powerful creatures to date, upon the game world in real time, and killing the client and servers at the exact moment. That sounds like a pretty cool in-game event, I must say. Since then, the game's quality has only looked up, especially in regards to its writing, a core necessity in the Final Fantasy franchise. Heaven's Sword, the MMO's first expansion, was considered a phenomenal work of art, a grandiose high fantasy tale that subverts and critiques common tropes of the genre. And while Stormblood isn't considered quite as good, common complaints include it feeling rushed, with it obvious that the two expansions and story were squeezed into one, it's still a perfectly fine expansion to most players. On top of the prior expansion being repeated hits over the years, Final Fantasy XIV introduced and revamped its combat systems and endgame content to make it more approachable to new players. Released in July 2019, Shadowbringers is where most players say the game, and even the Final Fantasy franchise, has peaked so far. It pulls a higher Metacritic score than nearly every other game in the franchise. Arguably, this is where one can say the increase of players trying out 14 began, but game quality alone isn't enough to bring in hundreds and thousands of new players. Already, 14 had a free trial for a while with plenty of the standard anti-bot restrictions. No marketplace, no selling social requests, no private messages, and a currency limit. Notably, it only ran up to level 35, which only gets the player up to a major character revelation before leaving them on an awkward cliffhanger. It also, of course, doesn't allow a fuller kit of combat class abilities, as the first major landmark for class execution is level 50, and continues every 10 levels. When the pandemic hit in 2020, even the limited trial was more than enough for many players to hop on and give Final Fantasy XIV a shot before committing fully to the game and the subscription. There was an obvious bump in players as many quiet worlds began having queues between during peak times. However, around the same time, the Final Fantasy XIV announced the 5.3 patch, Reflections in Crystal, which would expand the trial. Firstly, bookmark this patch in your mind, 5.3. If you're still keeping track of the timeline, that expanded trial was also among a slew of other quality of life updates in the end of the Shadowbringers arc. If you've been in the gaming community within the past few months and seen the free trial meme, this is pretty much where it comes from. Patch 5.3 expanded free trial to include Heaven's Sword and raised the level cap for all classes, combat and non-combat, to 60. And as previously discussed, Heaven's Sword is goddamn good. Many players prefer it over Shadowbringers by mere personal opinion, but the hype wasn't powered by the trial alone. Reflections and Crystal is still praised as one of the best story content drops to date. It's even considered by some to be better than the rest of the Shadowbringers. It has also implemented fly into the base game's areas, implemented this expansion's obligatory level grinding content, introduced a fan favourite daily tribe quest, and more. In other words, the free trials released during the golden era of Final Fantasy XIV content, right smack in the middle of a global stay-at-home pandemic, sent the hype train flying. And yes, the trial did make a difference, and director Yokomi Nishida told us as much in a recent interview. Again, introducing the free trial to friends became a meme, and bunny girls now wreak havoc across the gaming community. Now for the elephant in the room. The World of Warcraft Exodus. WoW players converting to Final Fantasy XIV has been a phenomenon for quite a while. WoW refugees is a common term for such players, who often contrast their former home with Final Fantasy XIV's relatively accepting user base, approachable combat, transparent development team, and consistent story. These were fairly neutral and even relaxed assessments by such refugees until lately, as vitriol towards World of Warcraft and its development team has been bubbling for a few months now. Players waited for World of Warcraft's first expansion patch 9.1 for 9 months, hoping at least the story would improve. All the while, complaints of a toxic fanbase, time-gated story content, and grinding that felt practically like a forced job of its own continued to bubble up and wear players down. And then, World of Warcraft's 9.1 patch dropped. Unfortunately for Activision Blizzard, it did not give a fresh breath of air as many WoW players hoped. In fact, the story contained what's been nearly universally panned as awful, a shallow twist for a character that's been, to say the least, troubled. This seemed to be the nail in the coffin for many players, as memes and threads came out calling WoW its own worst enemy. So here we are now with what's essentially one of the, if not the, biggest exoduses into a new non-game and gaming history. The closest player upticks I can think of would be No Man's Sky or Warframe, but neither comes close to what's happening here in Final Fantasy XIV. For now, it sounds like Final Fantasy XIV and its players will have to stick with these good problems among others that come with a wave of new, curious players. Now, I want to play the game now. I've played Final Fantasy XIV once, and that was in the aforementioned base game. In fact, it wasn't even in the base game, it was the open beta or closed beta, I can't remember which, but it was before the game's launch, and I downloaded it, played it on PC. I think I put a solid day into it, maybe about 8 hours or so, and my takeaway was, this is just another MMORPG. I didn't think it was bad, I thought it was perfectly fine. It didn't really feel like a Final Fantasy game to me, but I thought, this is serviceable, I might try the full game at some point. I didn't. I didn't, no. Because once the game came out, the reviews came out, you know, I just lost interest. There's nothing like a slew of bad reviews to really kind of turn you off a game. Not necessarily critic reviews, but if the gaming community at large is panning it as well, it can really turn you off to a game. So then I've just left it. And since then it's just been something that's kind of bubbling in the background. I know of its existence, and you know, I keep track of new releases, so I know they just keep churning out those expansion packs. And I've seen people at my work sometimes playing or talking about it, and I've never really thought about playing it until recently. Now that I've read that article, that's actually made me quite excited to play the game, I must say. Now, I don't have any plans to play it in the short term. Reason being is that there is talks of a Xbox Series X and S upgrade in the future. Apparently they're working on a PS5 upgrade at the moment, and then the Xbox version will come further down the line. So I think I'm probably going to hold out until then. Not just that, but apparently the new expansion that's coming out ends the current storyline that's been coming since the game launched, or since A Realm Reborn launched. So I will be looking to play that at some point. But short term though, I'm really happy for the game that it's managed to come this far, from being on the very crisp of extinction, It's like a dinosaur evolving at the last minute to grow wings to let it flow out to space, So yeah, if you're a Final Fantasy fan, I'd be really interested to know what your story is with the game. If you want to write a letter in, our email address is down below at the bottom of this video. If you're watching this later in life, maybe 6 months after the fact, just double check one of our recent videos just to make sure that this email address is still correct. But I'd be really interested to know what the game's like. So if anyone's watching this who plays Final Fantasy 14, please write in and just let me know what it is about Final Fantasy 14 that solidifies you as a consistent player in the game. Have you always been into Final Fantasy 14? Are you a WoW refugee or a Guild Wars 2 refugee? And if so, what lured you over and what's kept you there? And also, if someone wants to let me know what the story is about in very vague, non-spoilery terms, feel free to name drop things that are completely out of context for someone who's never played it. But I'd be really interested to hear. So if any Final Fantasy 14 players want to write in, or even if you wanted to talk about it in a topic that's completely your own, feel free to write in. We'll read it out on the air and we'll get a bit of civil discourse going.